The bitter chill of the November wind sliced through Beatrice Palmer's threadbare coat as she trudged through the muddy streets of Seattle, Washington in 1885, her boots worn through and her spirit nearly broken. 22 years of life had taught her little about survival in this booming frontier city that had sprung from wilderness to bustling port in the span of a generation. The timber and fishing industries drew men by the hundreds, but for a woman alone, Seattle offered few respectable options. Rain began to fall, cold and piercing, as the last light of day faded from the cloud-heavy sky. Beatrice clutched her small canvas bag containing everything she owned in the world: a spare dress, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, and $7.36, the remainder of her savings after the arduous journey west from Chicago. She had arrived with dreams of teaching, but found the position she'd corresponded about already filled by the school superintendent's niece. 3 weeks of searching for respectable employment had left her destitute. Tonight would be the fourth night she had no place to sleep, and the weather was worsening. She had spent the previous nights huddled in doorways, but with the rain turning to sleet, she knew she needed better shelter or she might not survive until morning. At the edge of town, Beatrice spotted a large barn, its weathered boards offering the promise of dry refuge. She glanced around nervously, then slipped through the partially open door. The interior was dim but warm with the heat of animals. Several horses shifted in their stalls, and the sweet smell of hay filled her nostrils. A ladder led to a hayloft above. Climbing carefully, Beatrice found the loft mostly full of fresh hay. She burrowed into it gratefully, creating a nest that would both hide and warm her. The exhaustion of the day washed over her, and despite her hunger and fear, she quickly fell into a deep sleep. "Madam, excuse me, madam." The deep voice startled Beatrice awake. She sat up with a gasp, hay clinging to her chestnut hair and plain dress. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, and a tall man in a weather-beaten hat stood at the top of the ladder, regarding her with curious blue eyes. "I don't mean to disturb you, but this is my property," he said, his voice gentler than his words. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, terror flooding her veins. She'd heard stories of what happened to women caught trespassing. "I'm sorry, sir. I just needed shelter from the storm. I'll leave immediately." The man studied her for a long moment. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face tanned by sun and weather. His dark blonde hair fell in waves beneath his hat, and his beard was neatly trimmed. Though dressed in simple work clothes, a flannel shirt, worn denim pants, and scuffed boots, there was a quiet dignity about him. "You're welcome to come down and have some coffee before you go," he offered, gesturing toward the barn door. "It's bitter cold this morning." Beatrice hesitated. Every instinct told her to flee, but her body ached with cold and hunger. Slowly, she gathered her small bag and followed him down the ladder. "Name's Russell Northcott," he said as they walked across the yard toward a modest but well-maintained cabin. "I've got a small spread here, just outside Seattle." "Beatrice Palmer," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize for trespassing, Mr. Northcott." Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth and the aroma of coffee filled the warm air. The interior was simple but tidy, with a wooden table and chairs, a small kitchen area, and doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Russell gestured for her to sit at the table while he poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. "What brings you to Seattle, Miss Palmer? You don't sound like you're from these parts." Beatrice wrapped her cold hands around the warm mug, fighting back tears of exhaustion and relief at the simple kindness. "I came for a teaching position, but it was filled before I arrived. I've been looking for work, but—" Russell nodded, seeming to understand what she couldn't say, that a young woman alone had few options in this frontier town. "And no family or friends to help you?" "No, sir. My parents passed years ago. I was raised by an aunt in Chicago, but she died last spring." Beatrice took a sip of the strong coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. Russell studied her thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Palmer, I can't in good conscience send you back into town with nowhere to go." He cleared his throat. "I have a spare room. You're welcome to it, no conditions. Just until you find your feet." Beatrice stared at him, searching for any hint of impropriety in his offer, but found only genuine concern. Still, she had been raised properly. "That's very kind, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to stay in a bachelor's home, Mrs. Wilkins from town comes by 3 days a week to help with cooking and laundry. She's here today, as a matter of fact." As if on cue, the door opened, and a plump, gray-haired woman entered with an armful of linens. "Oh," the woman exclaimed upon seeing Beatrice. "I didn't know you had company, Mr. Northcott. Mrs. Wilkins, this is Miss Palmer. She's had some misfortune and needs a place to stay for a while. I've offered the spare room." Mrs. Wilkins looked Beatrice over with sharp eyes that softened at the sight of her bedraggled appearance. "Well, that's mighty Christian of you, Mr. Northcott. I'll get the room ready right away." She bustled off through one of the doors. "See," Russell said with a slight smile, "everything proper, and in return, perhaps you could help Mrs. Wilkins with some of the household tasks." "I'm not much for domestic matters myself." Beatrice felt a wave of relief so profound she nearly wept. "Thank you, Mr. Northcott. I don't know how to repay your kindness. No need for repayment, just helping a neighbor in need." He stood, refilling her coffee. "Now, how about some breakfast? You look like you could use a good meal." Over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Beatrice learned that Russell had come to Washington Territory 8 years earlier. He'd worked in logging camps and saved enough to buy this small property where he raised horses and did some farming. He wasn't wealthy, but he was comfortable and respected in the community. "Why horses?" Beatrice asked, curious about this quiet, generous man. "I've always had a way with them," he explained, a rare smile warming his features. "Even as a boy in Missouri, I could calm the wildest stallion. Out here, with the logging camps and expanding settlements, there's good money in breeding and training solid working horses." After breakfast, Mrs. Wilkins showed Beatrice to a small but clean bedroom with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry," the older woman said kindly. "It's perfect," Beatrice replied truthfully, overwhelmed by her change in circumstances. That afternoon, Beatrice insisted on helping Mrs. Wilkins with the household chores. As they worked, the older woman shared the local gossip and information about Seattle. "Town's growing fast," Mrs. Wilkins explained as they kneaded bread dough. "Lots of opportunities, but not many for a single lady without connections." She gave Beatrice a sympathetic look. "You're lucky Mr. Northcott found you. He's a good man. Lost his wife and baby 5 years back in childbirth. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest as the day is long." "I'm very grateful," Beatrice said softly. "I promise I won't impose for long, Mrs." Wilkins patted her flour-covered hand. "Don't you worry about that. Having a young woman around might do him some good. That man needs more than horses for company." The next few days established a routine. Beatrice rose early to help with breakfast before Russell headed out to work with his horses. She spent her days assisting Mrs. Wilkins or tending to tasks around the cabin when the older woman wasn't there. In the evenings, she and Russell would share a simple dinner, their conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they grew more comfortable with each other. On her 4th day at the cabin, Russell surprised her by bringing home a Seattle newspaper with teaching advertisements circled. "Thought you might want to look into these," he said gruffly, handing her the paper. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you're a teacher." Beatrice's heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, I am, or I was hoping to be. I attended normal school in Chicago. Plenty of new settlements springing up that need educated folks," Russell commented. "Don't give up on that dream just yet." That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Russell asked about her journey west. Beatrice found herself telling him about her life in Chicago, her aunt's death, and her decision to seek a new beginning in the West. "It was foolish to come with so little planning," she admitted, embarrassed by her naivety. "I had exchanged letters with the school board here, but I should have secured a firm commitment." "Not foolish," Russell disagreed, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Brave. Takes courage to leave everything familiar behind." The following week brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed the countryside in white. Beatrice stood at the window, watching Russell trudge through knee-deep snow to the barn to care for his horses. The sight of his tall figure against the pristine landscape stirred something within her admiration for his strength and dedication, and something else she wasn't ready to name. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots at the door, his face was red with cold, but his eyes crinkled with pleasure at seeing her waiting. "Beautiful out there," he said, hanging his coat, "but I'm glad to be back inside." "I made stew," Beatrice offered, suddenly shy, "and Mrs. Wilkins showed me how to make sourdough bread yesterday. Smells wonderful." He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his serious face and made Beatrice's heart skip. Over dinner, Russell told her stories of his early days in the territory of logging camps and frontier justice, of the majestic beauty of the Cascade Mountains and the wild Pacific coast. Beatrice found herself captivated not just by the tales but by the man himself, his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. As the snow continued to fall over the next few days, they were essentially isolated on the property. Mrs. Wilkins couldn't make the journey from town, so Beatrice took on all the household duties. She found a rhythm in the work, taking pride in creating a comfortable home. One evening, as they sat before the fire, Russell cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you might like some books to read. I don't have many, but—" He rose and retrieved a small stack of volumes from a shelf. Beatrice accepted them eagerly, running her fingers over the leather bindings. There were several novels, a book of poetry, and a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's plays. "Do you read these often?" she asked, surprised by his literary interests. "When the winters are long," he admitted. "My mother was a teacher before she married. She taught me to love reading." "My mother was the same," Beatrice said softly, feeling a new connection between them. "She died when I was 12, but I remember her reading to me every night. My Josephine, my late wife, she enjoyed poetry," Russell said, his voice growing quiet. "She used to read aloud on evenings like this." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife, and Beatrice saw the shadow of old grief pass across his face. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said gently. Russell nodded, staring into the fire. "It was a long time ago, but thank you." As December progressed, the snow melted enough for Mrs. Wilkins to return, bringing news of town along with supplies. She raised an eyebrow at the comfortable domesticity she found, but made no comment beyond a knowing smile at Beatrice. "The Peterson family is looking for someone to teach their 4 children," Mrs. Wilkins mentioned casually as she and Beatrice prepared dinner. "They live about 5 miles east, have a big homestead. They'd provide room and board plus a small salary." Beatrice's heart leapt at the prospect of teaching again, then fell at the thought of leaving Russell's cabin, leaving Russell. In the weeks she had been there, something had changed between them. Nothing improper had occurred, but she felt a growing attachment to this quiet, honorable man who had saved her from desperation. "That sounds promising," she said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Would you mind giving me their information?" That night, she told Russell about the teaching opportunity. His face remained impassive, but she noticed his knuckles whiten as he gripped his coffee mug. "Sounds like a good situation," he said finally. "The Petersons are good people." "I've sold them horses before." "Yes," Mrs. Wilkins spoke highly of them. Beatrice hesitated, then added, "Of course, I should start looking for a permanent position. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long." Russell met her eyes then, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "You haven't imposed, Miss Palmer. Your presence has been welcome." The following day, Russell offered to drive Beatrice to the Peterson farm in his wagon. The journey took them through snow-covered forests and past frozen streams, the beauty of the winter landscape momentarily distracting Beatrice from her conflicted feelings. "It's so peaceful out here," she commented, her breath visible in the cold air. "So different from Chicago." Russell nodded, his hands steady on the reins. "That's what drew me to this territory, space to breathe, room to build something of my own." When they arrived at the Peterson homestead, they were greeted warmly by Mrs. Peterson, a cheerful woman with 4 lively children ranging from 6 to 12 years old. Mr. Peterson showed them the small but comfortable room that would be Beatrice's if she took the position. "We'd need you to teach the children 6 days a week." Mr. Peterson explained. Basic subjects reading, writing, arithmetic, some history and geography. The older ones help with farm chores before and after lessons. And you'd be like family, Mrs. Peterson added. Take meals with us, have Sundays free. It was a good offer, better than Beatrice had hoped for when she'd arrived in Seattle with nothing. Yet as she discussed the details with the Petersons, she found herself thinking of Russell's cabin, of quiet evenings by the fire, of the growing comfort she felt in his presence. On the return journey, they rode in silence for a time, the only sound the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the horses' hooves. They seemed like good people, Russell finally said, his voice carefully neutral. Will you take the position? Beatrice studied her gloved hands. They offered very fair terms. I should give them my answer by the end of the week. Russell nodded, his profile stoic against the setting sun. Whatever you decide, I want you to know you've always got a place at my cabin if you need it. That simple statement, offered without pressure or expectation, touched Beatrice deeply. Thank you, Russell, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. That means more than I can say. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, the atmosphere between them felt charged with unspoken feelings. Russell seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at Beatrice when he thought she wasn't looking. Finally, he spoke. I received a letter today from a rancher near Tacoma. He's interested in buying 3 of my horses. That's wonderful news, Beatrice said, genuinely happy for him. Yes, good business. He hesitated, then continued, I'll need to deliver them personally. It's about a 2-day journey each way. I was thinking of leaving the day after tomorrow. Oh. Beatrice felt a strange disappointment. Of course, your business is important. Russell studied her face. I was wondering. That is, I thought perhaps you might want to come along, see a bit more of the territory before you decide about the teaching position. Beatrice's heart quickened. Would that be appropriate? Mrs. Wilkins could accompany us as chaperone, Russell said quickly. We'd stay at proper hotels. I just thought you might enjoy the journey and it would give you a chance to see more opportunities beyond Seattle. The idea was tempting, not just the chance to see more of Washington territory, but the opportunity to spend more time with Russell before making her decision about the Petersons. I would like that very much, she admitted. If Mrs. Wilkins is willing, Mrs. Wilkins, as it turned out, was more than willing. A trip to Tacoma, how exciting, she exclaimed when Russell proposed the plan the next morning. My sister lives there. I haven't seen her in months. Preparations for the journey occupied the next day. Beatrice washed and pressed her spare dress, while Russell readied the horses and wagon. Mrs. Wilkins packed a basket of food for the journey and advised Beatrice on what to expect in Tacoma. It's growing even faster than Seattle, she explained. The railroad arrived there first, you know. Lots of fancy new buildings and businesses. They set out early the following morning, the wagon loaded with supplies and the 3 horses Russell was delivering tied behind. The December air was crisp but not bitter, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. Beatrice sat beside Russell on the wagon seat, with Mrs. Wilkins beside her. As they traveled south, Russell pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. Beatrice found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, captivated by his knowledge and subtle humor. They stopped for lunch by a frozen creek, spreading a blanket on the ground and sharing the bread, cheese, and dried fruit Mrs. Wilkins had packed. Afterward, Russell showed Beatrice how to approach his horses properly, guiding her hand as she stroked their velvety noses. They're beautiful, she said, admiring a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. What's her name? Penny, Russell replied, his hand still covering hers on the horse's neck. She's the gentlest of the 3, good for a beginner rider. Oh, I couldn't possibly ride, Beatrice protested. I've never learned. Russell's eyes crinkled with amusement. Everyone should know how to ride, Miss Palmer. Perhaps I could teach you sometime. The warmth in his voice made Beatrice blush. I would like that, she admitted softly. That evening, they reached a small settlement where Russell knew the proprietor of a modest inn. True to his word, he secured proper accommodations, a private room for Beatrice, another for Mrs. Wilkins, and a third for himself. After a simple but satisfying dinner in the inn's dining room, Beatrice found herself alone with Russell on the porch while Mrs. Wilkins visited with the innkeeper's wife, whom she knew from church. "Are you comfortable?" Russell asked, his concern genuine. "The accommodations aren't fancy, but the rooms are clean." "Everything is perfect," Beatrice assured him, drawing her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Thank you for suggesting this journey. It's been wonderful to see more of the territory." Russell leaned against the porch railing, his tall figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. "I've enjoyed having company. I tend to make these trips alone." Beatrice studied his profile, struck by how his presence had come to represent safety and comfort to her in such a short time. "Do you ever get lonely out on your property by yourself?" Russell was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice low. "After Josephine died, I thought the solitude would be easier, and for a time it was, but lately." He turned to look at her, his expression unguarded. "Lately, I've been thinking there might be more to life than work and solitude." Beatrice's heart raced at his words and the intensity of his gaze. "I understand," she said softly. "After my aunt died, I thought a fresh start was what I needed. But perhaps what I really needed was to find someone that felt like home." The air between them seemed to still, charged with possibility. For a moment, Beatrice thought Russell might step closer, might take her hand, or even, "There you are, Mrs." Wilkins's cheerful voice broke the moment as she bustled onto the porch. "Martha, that's Mrs. Johnson. The innkeeper's wife has the most delicious apple cake cooling in the kitchen. She's invited us all to have a slice before bed." The spell broken, Russell straightened and offered his arm to each woman. "We shouldn't keep apple cake waiting," he said lightly, though his eyes lingered on Beatrice's face with unmistakable regret for the interrupted moment. They reached Tacoma the following afternoon. The city was indeed impressive, with substantial buildings lining the streets and an air of prosperity that even Seattle couldn't match. Russell conducted his business with the rancher, who was pleased with the quality of the horses and paid a fair price. Afterward, he took Beatrice and Mrs. Wilkins to dinner at a hotel that was far grander than Beatrice had expected. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and elegant couples dined at tables covered with fine white linens. "This is too extravagant," Beatrice whispered as they were seated, feeling out of place in her simple dress. "Nonsense," Russell replied. "It's a successful business trip we should celebrate." Mrs. Wilkins beamed at them both. "Indeed, and I must say you look lovely tonight, Beatrice. That blue dress brings out the color of your eyes." Beatrice blushed at the compliment and at the way Russell's gaze lingered appreciatively on her face. The evening passed in pleasant conversation, with Mrs. Wilkins regaling them with stories of early Tacoma and Seattle. By the time they finished their dessert, a delicate apple tart with fresh cream, Beatrice felt more relaxed and happy than she had in years. Outside the hotel, the night was clear and crisp, with stars brilliant overhead. "Would you ladies care for a short walk before returning to our lodgings?" Russell suggested. "The waterfront is quite beautiful at night." Mrs. Wilkins hesitated. "Oh, I'm afraid these old bones are quite tired. Perhaps you young people could go and I'll wait in the lobby." Beatrice looked uncertainly at Russell, who offered his arm. "Just a short walk," he assured her. "We'll stay in plain view of the hotel." With Mrs. Wilkins's blessing, they strolled toward the waterfront. The night air was cold but invigorating, and the moon cast a silver path across the dark waters of Puget Sound. "It's magnificent," Beatrice breathed, gazing out at the vast expanse of water and the distant mountains. "Yes, it is," Russell agreed, though when she turned, she found him looking not at the view but at her. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Beatrice," he said softly, using her given name for the first time, "I need to tell you something before you make your decision about the Peterson position." She waited, her heart pounding. "These past weeks, having you in my home, it's changed something in me." Russell's voice was low and earnest. "I know it hasn't been long and I have no right to ask anything of you, but I find myself dreading the thought of you leaving." Beatrice swallowed, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I've felt it too," she admitted, "the thought of leaving. It's been harder than I expected." Russell took her gloved hands in his. I'm not asking for promises, just time to know each other better, to see if what I feel, what I hope we both feel, might grow into something more. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Northcott? Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. A compromise. Take the position with the Petersons if you wish, but allow me to court you properly. We could see each other on Sundays, perhaps attend church together. Get to know one another as equals, not as a woman in need and a man offering shelter. The proposal was so reasonable, so honorable, and so perfectly aligned with Beatrice's own unspoken wishes that she felt tears spring to her eyes. I would like that very much, she said softly. Russell's face broke into a smile of such genuine happiness that Beatrice felt her heart might burst. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and placed the gentlest of kisses on her cheek. Thank you, he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. They returned to Mrs. Wilkins, who pretended not to notice their clasped hands or flushed cheeks. The older woman's knowing smile, however, suggested she was far from surprised by this development. The journey back to Seattle was filled with a new sense of possibility. Beatrice and Russell talked more freely, sharing stories of their childhoods and dreams for the future. Mrs. Wilkins tactfully dozed in the back of the wagon during much of the trip, giving them a semblance of privacy. When they reached the Peterson farm on the way home, Beatrice explained her decision to accept the teaching position while making it clear she had personal connections in the area that would occupy her Sundays. Well, of course, dear Mrs. Peterson said with a smile, glancing between Beatrice and Russell. We wouldn't dream of taking up all your time. When can you start? It was decided that Beatrice would begin after the new year, giving her 2 more weeks at Russell's cabin. Those weeks passed in a blur of quiet joy, with Mrs. Wilkins's tacit approval. Russell began courting Beatrice, properly bringing her wildflowers he found growing in a sheltered valley, reading aloud from his books in the evening, and taking her on short rides around his property after he convinced her to try sitting on Gentle Penny. On Christmas Day, they exchanged simple gifts. Beatrice had secretly knitted Russell a warm scarf using yarn Mrs. Wilkins had brought from town. Russell presented Beatrice with a small wooden box he had carved himself, its lid inlaid with a design of mountains and trees. It's beautiful, she gasped, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Open it, Russell urged. Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a horseshoe. For luck, he explained, and to remember our beginning, even if it was in a hayloft. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. I could never forget, she whispered. The day Beatrice moved to the Peterson farm was bittersweet. Russell drove her himself, helping to carry her few belongings now augmented by some practical items he and Mrs. Wilkins had insisted she accept as gifts to her new room. Sunday is only 4 days away, he reminded her as they said goodbye at the Petersons' gate. I'll come for you after church. Those first weeks of their courtship established a pattern. Beatrice threw herself into teaching the Peterson children during the week, finding joy in their eager minds and the respect she received from the family. But her heart longed for Sundays, when Russell would arrive promptly after church services to take her for the afternoon and evening. Sometimes they joined community gatherings, where Russell proudly introduced Beatrice to his neighbors and business associates. Other times, they spent quiet hours at his cabin, talking or reading while Mrs. Wilkins bustled about, providing the necessary chaperonage while discreetly giving them space. As winter gave way to spring, their feelings deepened. Russell spoke more openly of his hopes for expanding his horse breeding business, and Beatrice shared her dreams of someday having a proper schoolhouse instead of teaching in private homes. One Sunday in April, as they walked through a meadow near Russell's property where wildflowers had begun to bloom, he stopped suddenly and turned to her. Beatrice, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I know it hasn't been very long, but I've never been more certain of anything. Her heart pounding, Beatrice watched as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I'm not a wealthy man, he continued, and I can't offer you the luxuries you might have had in Chicago. But I can promise to love you, respect you, and build a good life with you." He opened the pouch, revealing a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Beatrice Palmer, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Russell, yes." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her, their first real kiss, gentle at first, then with growing passion that left them both breathless. "I love you, Beatrice," he murmured against her hair. "From that first morning when I found you in my hayloft, something in me recognized you as the missing piece of my heart." "And I love you," she replied, marveling at how completely this man had transformed her life. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." They were married on a perfect June day in 1886 in Seattle's white-steepled church. Mrs. Wilkins wept happy tears in the front pew, while the Petersons and many other neighbors filled the small church to capacity. Beatrice wore a new dress of ivory silk, a gift from her students' parents, and carried wildflowers Russell had gathered that morning. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising love, fidelity, and partnership through whatever life might bring. When Russell slipped the gold band behind her engagement ring, and the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she had never expected to find when she'd stepped off that train in Seattle the previous autumn. The celebration afterward was held at Russell's now their cabin, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung from tree branches. There was music from local fiddlers, home-cooked food contributed by neighbors, and dancing that continued until well after sunset. As Russell led Beatrice in a dance, holding her closer than propriety might normally allow, he whispered, "Happy, Mrs. Northcott?" The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. Later that night, alone in the cabin that was now truly their home, their love found its full expression. Russell was tender and patient, guiding Beatrice through the initial discomfort to discover the deep joy of complete union. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt a profound sense of peace and belonging. "I never expected this," she murmured, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "When I came west, I was just hoping to find a teaching position, a way to support myself." Russell kissed her forehead. "And I never expected to find a beautiful woman sleeping in my hayloft who would change my entire life." His blue eyes grew serious. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on us." "It was the easiest choice I've ever made," Beatrice assured him. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. Beatrice continued to teach, though now she took students in their home rather than living with another family. Russell's horse breeding business prospered, his reputation for quality stock spreading throughout the territory. In the spring of 1887, they added a room to the cabin, Russell working alongside hired carpenters to create a bright, airy space with large windows overlooking the mountains. It was to be a classroom for Beatrice's growing number of students, but they both knew it could serve another purpose in the future. That future arrived sooner than they expected. By Christmas of that year, Beatrice was certain she was with child. The news filled Russell with both joy and anxiety, given his history with Josephine. He insisted Beatrice see the best doctor in Seattle regularly and hired extra help around the farm to ensure she didn't overexert herself. "You're fussing too much," Beatrice protested one evening as Russell arranged pillows behind her back by the fire. "I'm perfectly healthy. The doctor said so himself." "Indulge me," Russell replied, his hand gently caressing her growing belly. "I couldn't bear to lose you." Beatrice covered his hand with hers. "You won't lose me, or this baby. We're stronger together, remember?" In August of 1888, after a difficult but ultimately successful labor, their son was born. They named him Samuel after Beatrice's father, and he had Russell's blue eyes and Beatrice's determined chin. Russell wept when the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking from his son to his exhausted but radiant wife. "You're both perfect." Samuel grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere and loved to sit on Beatrice's lap during reading lessons. Their family felt complete, their happiness overwhelming, until the winter of 1890 brought an unexpected blessing Beatrice was expecting again. Their daughter, Elizabeth, arrived in July of 1891, a tiny, dark-haired beauty with her mother's hazel eyes and sweet disposition. Samuel, not quite 3, was initially suspicious of the newcomer, but soon appointed himself her protector. 2 children, Russell marveled one evening as they watched Samuel carefully showing Elizabeth a wooden horse he had carved with his father. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that this would be my life. I know, Beatrice agreed, leaning against his shoulder. That desperate woman sleeping in your hayloft could never have imagined this happiness. As Seattle and Washington state grew and prospered into the 1890s, so did the Northcott family and their property. Russell built a proper house to replace the original cabin, which became his office and tack room. The new home had 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen with a modern stove, and a dedicated classroom space where Beatrice continued to teach local children. Russell's horse business expanded to include a successful breeding program and training services. He hired 2 young men as assistants, teaching them the trade while giving himself more time with his family. Beatrice, though still teaching, also became known locally for her organizational skills, helping to establish Seattle's first public library and serving on committees to improve education throughout the county. In 1894, they welcomed their 3rd child, another boy they named James. With 3 healthy children, a thriving business, and their deep, abiding love for each other, the Northcotts embodied the promise and possibility of the American West. One autumn afternoon in 1895, as Beatrice watched 7-year-old Samuel helping his father with the horses, 4-year-old Elizabeth drawing pictures at the kitchen table, and baby James napping in his cradle, she was struck by a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Russell, coming in from the barn, noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, crossing to her side. "Nothing at all," Beatrice assured him, reaching for his hand. "I was just thinking about how your decision to offer shelter to a desperate stranger changed everything. For both of us." Russell's face softened as he pulled her into his arms. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her hair. "That night you spent in my hayloft was the beginning of my real life." Beatrice leaned back to look into his beloved face, now showing lines of experience and weathering but still handsome, still capable of making her heart race. "And mine," she whispered. "That cold night in your barn was the first step on the path home." As the century drew to a close, the Northcott family continued to grow and thrive along with their expanding community. Seattle transformed from frontier town to bustling city, while their property remained a peaceful haven just beyond its boundaries. Russell became a respected businessman and civic leader, while Beatrice's teaching and community work earned her the admiration of neighbors and city officials alike. Their children grew strong and capable, each developing distinct personalities and interests. Samuel showed his father's way with horses and his mother's love of learning. Elizabeth revealed artistic talents and a kind heart that drew people to her. Young James combined his father's quiet strength with his mother's quick intelligence. Through it all, through economic ups and downs, through illnesses and celebrations, through the everyday challenges of marriage and parenthood, Beatrice and Russell's love remained the cornerstone of their lives. The bond that had begun with an act of simple kindness in a hayloft had deepened into a partnership of equals, a sharing of dreams, a haven of mutual respect and enduring passion. On the 20th anniversary of the day they met, Russell surprised Beatrice with a special gift, a small replica of his barn, carved from wood with incredible detail, including a tiny hayloft with a miniature figure sleeping inside. "To always remember where our story began," he said, presenting it to her after the children had gone to bed. Beatrice traced the tiny carving with her fingers, tears welling in her eyes. "As if I could ever forget," she whispered. That cold barn was the warmest place I'd ever found because it led me to you. Russell gathered her close, his love as strong and steady as it had been when they first discovered it. And every day since has been warmer still. He murmured against her lips before kissing her with the familiar passion that had never diminished with time. Outside their window, Seattle's lights twinkled in the distance. A far cry from the rough frontier town Beatrice had arrived in all those years ago. But here in Russell's arms, in the home they had built together, she knew the true meaning of frontier spirit, the courage to offer kindness without conditions, to accept it with grace, and to build a life of love from the humblest of beginnings.